So hello and welcome back to Books and Things. This is the second part of my October wrap-up. In the first part, which I will link down below, I spoke about all the classics I've read this month, and in this part I'm going to be talking about all the contemporary books I read this month. I've decided to split my wrap-up into two this month just because I had an extraordinarily productive reading month and managed to read 18 books. I don't know how, but I did. The first two, which I'm not going to talk about much here, are Nicking Time by T. Tranter and A Snow Garden by Rachel Joyce. These two I read in the Dewey's 24-hour readathon, so I will link my wrap-up for that down below. So the first one was actually my favourite book of the month. It was my joint favourite with Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, which I spoke about in my classics wrap-up, and that was The Chimes by Anna Smail, which I just absolutely loved. It was incredible. I fell in love with this book so much. I've already spoken about it in my On My Shelf video, which I will link down below, but I was just really blown away by this book. It's a dystopian novel set in a world that is almost entirely ruled by music. It follows the story of Simon, a young man who travels to London after the death of his parents. In this book, the world is ruled by music. Written words are not allowed, and no one can read or write, and daily there are these things called the chimes, this loud music that occurs that kind of makes everybody forget, so that slowly everybody is forgetting. It's just an incredibly inventive idea, and because the world is ruled by music, the language that the book is told in is slightly changed, so like people don't walk fast, they walk presto and that sort of thing, which I just thought was so inventive and brilliant. I wanted it to be like 3 times as long, but I did absolutely love it. There is a full review of this on my blog, which I will link down below, and I will link the other video where I talked about it. Next, I read Room by Emma Donoghue. I've been meaning to read this for ages and finally got around to reading it for a book club I'm in. Room is told from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy who lives with his mother in a room that he has never been out of. As becomes clear very early on, his mother was abducted when she was quite young, and they are held prisoner by this man who is only ever referred to as Old Nick. I'm not going to say any more about it because I think that would spoil the book, but it's a very interesting exploration of like a child's viewpoint, because Jack is 5 years old, it's all told first person, his perspective, and he obviously doesn't understand completely what's going on, and we understand what's going on much more than him. It wasn't like a pleasant book to read. I'm not sure I liked it, but it was really good, if that makes sense, and I definitely recommend it. I think it's a very interesting one to read. Like, some bits are very, very distressing, but there's also hope in there, and the tenderness between Jack and his mother and their relationship is really beautiful and really nicely done, and kind of helps you cope with all the trauma and awfulness that is in this book. So yeah, like I say, I'm not sure I liked it, but I really recommend it. And next, Hark! A Vagrant by Kate Beaton. This is a book of comics, so quite different to the stuff I normally read, but absolutely wonderful. I discovered Kate Beaton's website, also called Hark! A Vagrant, quite a while ago, years and years ago, and started reading her comics. There's a lot of like literary and historical in-jokes in her comics, which I find really, really funny and really enjoy. It's just absolutely my kind of thing. So yeah, I've been reading her website for years and years, and then last week she came into the bookshop where I work to sign some books, and then I thought, well, it's about time I buy one of her books, and then she signed it and she drew a picture, and it was really exciting. Anyway, I therefore went home and read all of this. I'd read quite a lot of the comics before because I follow her website, but it was just really, really good, really hilarious, just funny, and funny in the way that really appeals to me, in the lot of jokes about like the Brontes and Jane Austen, which is basically what I want. Next, I read Kirsty Logan's collection of short stories, which is The Wrenchel Heart and Other Fairy Tales. I really enjoyed this. I partly read it because I was going to an event which she was speaking, and it was really nice to hear her speak. However, I borrowed this copy, it's not mine, so I didn't get it signed, sadly. But it was really interesting to hear her speak about her writing, and I thought this was a superb collection of short stories. If you like Angela Carter, you will like this. You also might like this if you don't like Angela Carter, because it is different, but there are a lot of like Angela Carter feelings and themes going through this, a lot of kind of taking ideas or tropes of fairy tales and twisting them in fascinating ways, which I just really loved, because I like Angela Carter a lot, and this was like Angela Carter but possibly even better. Do I mean that? I don't know. It was really good. Like, it's at times quite odd, and at times like Angela Carter, weird to the point of being unsettling, but also really brilliant, and at times really like tender and touching. My favourite 2 stories I think were Una and Cole Are Not Friends, which was just really lovely, and also Tiger Palace, which was the final story in this, which I really, really enjoyed. It reminded me a lot of a short story by Angela Carter called Lady of the House of Love, which is one of my favourite Angela Carter short stories from her The Bloody Chamber. I really recommend this. I think it might not be for everybody because, like I say, it is quite weird and magical and odd, but in a really beautiful, lovely, wonderful way. Next, another short story collection, and this was Used to Be by Elizabeth Baines. I got sent this review copy from the publishers, which is really exciting. The reason why Elizabeth Baines and the publishers decided to send me this was because I'd reviewed a couple of Elizabeth Baines' short stories on my blog. I will link both of those blog posts down below, and I really enjoyed the short stories of hers I've read, both of which actually appeared in this collection, and I also really enjoyed many of the others. I really like the way she writes. It's often really self-conscious in terms of dealing with ideas and themes of storytelling and what it means to tell a story, which I really like because it's just really my kind of thing. The short story collection is split into two sections. The first section is called What Was, What Is, which deals a lot with themes of memory. And then the second half was called What May Be and deals with like what if stories, deals with the idea of like turning points in your life where if you had decided one thing then your life might be like this, and if you had decided another thing your life might be like this. I really enjoy those kind of things, and I also am really interested in memory as a theme in stories, so these stories were right up my alley and I really enjoyed them. Some I enjoyed more than others, as often happens. Two of my favourites were the two I've reviewed before, which were Tides and This Turbulent Stillness. My other favourite was probably The Choice Chamber, which I thought was absolutely brilliant and just finished perfectly. It was exactly the right length, because often with short stories I do find they feel too short or too long, and The Choice Chamber was just perfect, just absolutely what I like. I also really loved the story Possibilities and What Do You Do If. In general, I think I preferred the second half of the book to the first half because I liked the kind of possibility what if stories more than the memory stories overall, but I did really love the whole collection. I thought it was brilliant and inventive and superbly written. I'm going to do a full book review on my blog, which I will link down below when it is up. And I know that I loved this collection of short stories and that it was really powerful and really worked because I read this, went home and wrote a short story. The next book I read was American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which I didn't physically read, I listened to it on audiobook, which on reflection was probably a mistake because it took me about 6 weeks to get through because I listened to audiobooks very slowly, whereas if I'd have read it, it would have probably taken me like 5 days. And one of the things I did find about this book was that it took me a very long time to get into it, and I don't know if that was because of the book or because I was listening to an audiobook. I think from now on, when listening to audiobooks, I'm going to try and listen to non-fiction or to books I've read before, so it doesn't really make a difference, but because I don't listen to audiobooks that much, I do find it tends to like spoil my concentration or I don't get properly engaged in the story. Moving on to actually talking about American Gods. The book begins with a young man, Shadow, getting out of prison, and once he gets out of prison, he is offered a job by a mysterious man called Wednesday, and he basically gets himself caught up in a war between gods that's going on in America. A war between the old gods of America who came over with settlers like hundreds of years ago and the new gods of America who are like the gods of TV and that sort of thing. It's a really weird book. I liked it, ultimately, but it took me a long time to like it. I only became properly engaged in the story from about halfway through, and from then on I liked it a lot more, but for the first half I was a bit sceptical. It's a very odd book. A lot of magic realism and a lot of creepy magic realism. It's very weird. The only thing I've read before which I think is like American Gods is Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. If you have read Kafka on the Shore and liked it, I would think you would like American Gods and vice versa. I actually didn't like Kafka on the Shore that much, and I liked American Gods more overall. But like I said, it took me a while to get into it. I've realised, I think, that I like my magic realism in short stories or in slightly smaller doses than it is in American Gods. However, I did come round to it by the end. There were a lot of characters I found really interesting, and I thought the ending and the whole like plot and its climax was done really, really well, which I did enjoy. It just took me a very long time to get into it. I think it's a bit of a Marmite book, and I don't think it's for everyone. Like, my boyfriend absolutely loved it, which is why I read it, and although I ended up liking it, I didn't like it as much as he did. So overall, I did like American Gods, but it did take me a long time to get into. And the last book I read this month was Montmorency and the Assassins by Eleanor Updale. This is the third in a series of books called the Montmorency series. I'm not going to tell you that much about this book because it will spoil the earlier ones. The first book begins with a criminal reinventing himself under the guise of a gentleman called Montmorency, and he spends half his time being Montmorency and half his time as a criminal, and completely kind of changes his identity in a way that is a bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Anyway, they are really interesting books. They are set in the Victorian period, which of course wins me over, and they tend to have a kind of detective plotline going on, which I also really enjoy. I'm not sure if they're children's books or not. Me and my boyfriend were trying to work out, because he read them when he was about 12, 13, and I'm reading them now, and I think in some ways they are children's books, but unlike most children's books where the characters are young, the characters in Montmorency are like in the first books in like their 20s and 30s, and by the third book are in like their 40s. I think they probably are children's books, but they're quite unusual children's books in that sense, but I actually really like that, and they're really good fun. This was possibly my favourite in the series so far. It involved a lot of travelling, and half the book was spent in like America and some of it in Italy as well as in London, and I just really enjoyed that whole like look at various different places in the 19th century, because that's something I'm really into. So yeah, I enjoyed them. They're really fun books, and I need to read the fourth one at some point too. So those were all the contemporary books I read this month. I will link down below my other wrap-up video of the month where I talk about all the classics I've read. It's been a busy month. I've read a lot of books. You can expect a lot less next month because of NaNoWriMo. But anyway, please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Let me know if you have any recommendations, especially if you have any recommendations for things I might like because I like Hark a Vagrant, because I love that. I love Kate Beaton, but I don't really know much else about comics and like comic strips and other stuff related to that. But anyway, that is enough of my rambling for now. I read a lot of books this month. I don't know how.